Okay, good afternoon. We'll get started without further ado. Thank you for everyone coming to this event. And I will briefly introduce our speaker today and get right to the presentation. So Professor Federico Pianzola is a tenured assistant professor in computational humanities at the University of Groningen, who's revolutionizing how we understand the relationship between readers and texts. His innovative work blends computational, qualitative, and quantitative methods to decode how we respond to literature. Beyond his research, he has also been a powerhouse in academic publishing, serving on editorial boards of several prestigious journals, including Cultural Analytics and the Journal of Computational Literary Studies, while also leading the International Society of the Empirical Study of Literature as its president. His expertise in computational literary studies, narrative theory, and digital social reading positions him at the cutting edge of understanding how technology is reshaping our experience of literature. Please join me in welcoming Federico Pianzola.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation in the first place. The screen is shared already on Zoom, right? No, yeah, okay. Just want to double check that. Okay, should be fine. Thank you. Thanks. And yes, today I've been asked to talk to you about the GOLEM project, which is a project I'm currently running. We are in we passed the second year now, and we have a few more years to go. But as you will see, it's a broader effort towards a bigger infrastructure that aims to provide a service to people who want to do comparative study of culture and more specifically of literature. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah. Okay, good enough. Thank you. And so what I will tell you about today is some of the reasons behind the choice of this project. So what is the motivation for research and the goal of the project? I'll talk a little bit about how we are collecting data that we are storing in this database and also using them to answer our research questions. And I'll share some preliminary results, also talking a little bit about the research design, the methodology we use to analyze the data that we have. And the starting point are stories. So this is the main object of my research. I'm very much interested in how people tell stories. This is something that has been recognized as being central for humans in many contexts. And the quote that I have on the screen here is just an example of how an American novelist considers stories to be more important sometimes than other kind of technologies, to the extent that they're more important than the will for some societies, she's claiming. Yes, of course. Should I stop already? Sorry, okay, no problem. I'll use the keyboard. Yeah. So, but why stories are important for humans? So this is the question I want to answer. It's a big one. It's not an easy question. There are some empirical studies that try to answer this question. For instance, there's evidence that reading fiction can help children to develop complex cognitive skills. There have been several tasks that have been tried with the narrative and fiction in comparison to other forms of text. Another possible effect of literature or fiction is empathy, right? learning about what other characters are doing, interacting, can help us become more attuned to other people's emotions and mind states, so that we can then make better decisions when interacting with other people. These are just some cases that have been provided to support evidence that fiction and stories are important for humans. But the perspective that I wanted to adopt is a broader one. So looking at not just in this moment in history why stories are important, not just looking at readers nowadays, but enlarging a little bit the perspective on this phenomenon and approach it from an evolutionary perspective, right? Why in human history have stories been considered important? And to frame this in a slightly different way, we can ask ourselves, do stories have an adaptive function? Or more broadly, art. Does art have an adaptive function? So this is the terms that evolutionary psychologists or biologists would use to frame this question. So in another way is more technical, is art a heritable trait that enhanced the reproductive rate of our ancestors? So if you talk about evolution, everything comes down to how successful is something to make sure that the species can be preserved and carry on living on the planet. And so this means that, can we find any evidence that fiction, telling stories to each other, has a direct positive impact on the success rate of the reproduction of a species? Well, there are different answers to this question. So a lot of scholars from different disciplines try to answer this question, and some said yes, there is that direct adaptive function of literature, of art, of fiction. And they say that, well, because we can simulate other people's experiences, this can make us more ready to deal with interactions with others, or we can simulate alternative scenarios of very dangerous situations, and we can be ready if any of these possible harm or dangerous situations can occur in real life. So this is the direct effect. Stories are making us more ready to face reality. But some of the people say that, no, this is not really a direct effect. This is just a secondary effect. So like a byproduct of other evolutionary processes, and art is just happening as a side byproduct of what's happening in society as part of social interactions. So maybe by telling stories, you can increase your social status, and this can have a positive effect on the chances you have of continuing your own genetic line, let's say. So there's no clear answer to this broader question about the possible role of fiction, of stories in human evolution. So to make it even more simple, the question comes down to, is there a direct evolutionary effect of fiction? So does it have an adaptive reproductive function, or is it more of a social phenomenon that somehow plays a role in how we interact with each other as humans, but it's not directly connected to the success of the human species? Well, I think it's very difficult to frame the question as it's been done so far. So the decision that I decided to make is that we're not to look necessarily at fiction, at stories as a broader phenomenon, but to try and answer the question of why are stories important by looking at how stories are made. What are the constituents of these stories? And so looking not the evolution of fiction as a behavior within society, but more looking at the evolution of fictional forms. So what is in the stories that we tell to each other? And especially what is in the stories that become successful in societies, that become read or listened to more and more? Because these are selected by a certain society or by groups of people within a society as being the most worth transmitting later on. And so when we talk about fictional forms, I mean something like, what are the types of characters that inhabit these stories? What are the events happening in these stories? What are the themes we talk about? What are the narrative strategies that we use to tell a story? Do we prefer to tell stories from first-person perspective, having access directly to the emotions and thoughts of characters? Or do we prefer to adopt a more detached third-person perspective, for instance? And also about style. Do you prefer to have a very complex and rich prose with a lot of effort maybe required by the reader, by the audience to understand what's going on and maybe to enjoy also the play with language? Or it's better to have a more direct communication? You maybe already start seeing that it's not such a straightforward answer that we can have here, right? There are a lot of complex processes involved, even in studying the evolution of fictional forms. But I think it's slightly easier than trying to answer the first question, looking at fiction as a behavioral phenomenon more broadly. So the question that we are trying to answer in the GOLEM project is, how do cultural traits, how do story traits spread, become successful, and disappear? So in an evolutionary perspective. Because maybe if we find that some traits gets transmitted more often, become successful and stay successful for a longer time, maybe there is something in those specific story traits that can tell us what makes stories important and worth using in society. To get more concrete, this is an example. So probably you know the novels or movies about Harry Potter. Like he was in one of the events in these novels, he was sorted by the sorting hat into the house of Gryffindor. So we have the original stories in English where one of the story traits that the character Harry Potter has is being in the house of Gryffindor. And I'm trying to here represent a possible evolution of this story trait, right? And these are retellings of the same stories by other people or by the same author, maybe in subsequent installation of the stories. And so this can be the context of fan fiction, right? Stories that are transforming some original material and retelling stories about these characters. And we could have that for some time in the English tradition, Harry Potter stays in the house of Gryffindor. But it might be the case that at some point, someone starts writing stories in Korean about Harry Potter, changing this story trait. So introducing an innovative element, putting Harry Potter not anymore in the house of Gryffindor, but in the house of Slytherin. Right? So we have a change, a new story trait that is appearing. If you want to continue the metaphor of the DNA, a new genetic mutation is happening here. And something can then happen from here on, right? We could have the same English tradition continuing to have the Gryffindor as the dominant trait, but it could be that the Slytherin trait appears also in the English tradition. And there could be two scenarios, right? One is that this is an original innovation also in the English tradition, independent from what happened in the Korean tradition. But it could also be that there is an influence of the Korean tradition into the English tradition. Maybe because the author can read Korean and has read that story, so has been influenced by that tradition. And this can become more complex with a lot of branching and cross transmissions across different branches. So maybe in Indonesia, people got influenced from the Korean tradition directly, and then second generation immigrants in an English-speaking country started to write stories influenced by the English tradition, but also by the stories told in their country of origin. So this is what, at the end of the GOLEM project, I want to be able to say. Like detect transmission patterns of specific story traits across time and across languages and cultures, and also across reading communities. Just to give you a concrete example that this is not just about fan fiction, not about popular culture, we could think about a classical example of these two characters, these two figures. One is called Jupiter, one is called Zeus. Before we had one character with same identity, Harry Potter, like a name allows us to identify very clearly who the character is. But in this case, we have two different characters identified by two different names. But if you look at these two representations of these two different characters, well, you will notice that they have something in common, right? Maybe the pose, they have the beard and the hair, the symbols that they are holding or that are included in the representation, there is something that we can see they have in common. And from the context, we also know that there is possibly an influence from the Greek tradition to the Roman tradition. So again, if you could break down the different cultural traits that constitute these two characters, the identity of these two characters, we could directly compare them and see how much of their cultural DNA is shared, and how much how many elements are new and have been introduced as a cultural mutations, let's say, in this lineage. And what we are doing is not just look at one tradition, but also in the examples I gave you already, looking across cultures and languages. And these are the 6 languages, actually now became 7, that we are focusing on in the GOLEM project. So we have English, Spanish, Italian from the Western world, let's say, and then Korean, Bahasa Indonesia, and Chinese from Asia. We try to cover, we can cover all continents actually with these languages, because they are spoken also in continents as a secondary official language. And to show you also how the intersection of transmission of story traits with actual current differences that there are between cultures, I used a tool, which is very interesting, which is called Cultural Distance Between Countries. You can find the reference in this article, which is a database of different cultural measures that have been used to identify the specificity of cultures around the globe. And this 3-diagram representation is showing you how distant 2 cultures are. So the longer the distance to go from one node to the other, the farther the cultural distance is between the 2 countries. So to go from Indonesia all the way up the tree and back to Italy, it takes a long time. It's a very long path. But to go from Canada to the US, it's a very short path, right? So the cultural distance between these 2 countries, it's very small in comparison to cultural distance between other countries represented in this graph. And so to put together what I told you before with this is, do we find influences of transmission of story traits across languages that somehow correlate with these cultural distances? So how easy it is for a story trait that appeared in South Korea to enter the English tradition, maybe, or how it is for an Indonesian trait to then enter one of the other national or language-specific traditions. And we can then compare what's actually we see gets transmitted in the stories with the supposed cultural difference that we know from other factors, and see if what traits can be transmitted, and if there is any association with these contextual factors of the country of origin, the culture of origin, and the target culture. Okay, so this was the first part about the why, motivation and goals of this project. But how can we start doing that? So do we look at fan fiction? Do we look at mythology, like Zeus and Jupiter? I'll go a little bit into this now. So this is an issue of what data are we selecting to answer our research question. And the problem here, the question to be asked is, how do we find a somehow unbiased sample, right? So what we're interested in is the transmission of story traits, right? We want to find out what in the story is meaningful, is a good signal of something that is worth transmitting. So we're interested in the value inside the story somehow. Remember, characters, style, events, themes. So we need somehow a data sample that doesn't have too many external influences on the possible transmission of these traits. And if you think about literary traditions in different countries, that's not really the case, because we have a lot of different stakeholders and institutions that are playing a strong role in deciding what is worth transmitting. So we have school curricula, right? What you are forced to read in school. It's what most of the people in the country are reading, but this is decided by someone else. It's not really maybe based on a decision which is intrinsic to the story. We have literary scholars that are reviewing books or publishing, talking about them in specialized journals or in magazine and newspapers. So they increase the visibility of these works. And so you see that there are publishing houses, right, that in the first place decide based on the manuscript that they receive what is worth publishing. Right? So there's a lot of filters that decide what gets published and transmitted to further generations. We have libraries that decide what it's worth archiving and preserving for the population to read. So there's a lot of biases, cultural biases, and stakeholders that are playing a role in here. So there's a lot of noise that we don't want to deal with. So that's the first issue. And the second point is that if you want to understand the impact that stories have on humans, we need data about the impact of stories, right? We need to know if a story is successful, what people think about that story, they like it, how much they like it in comparison to another story. So we need to satisfy these two criteria when building our corpus. So is it feasible to look at fictional stories across hundreds of years, cultures, media, and publishing systems, school system, and so on? Very unlikely. So trying to reducing the complexity here, like it was not feasible for me to answer the first question about fiction in general. So I try to reduce the complexity and come to fictional forms as the object of study. I don't think it's feasible to study literary systems and literary traditions as a whole. Of course, this would be the ideal goal. I would really be happy to do this. But so, to reduce the complexity of this, I decided to focus on a very specific phenomenon. So written fiction in the context of digitalized and datafied culture. So only published online by millions of authors that I can map where they publish, because we can more or less know what are the most famous and used platforms for digital publishing in different countries. And well, at the same time, we can also have information about the reader response. So the impact that the stories have, because we have access to the comments, the ratings, and the reviews that people leave about these stories. And I can focus on a very small time frame, so around 20 years. So it's more manageable. And you would say, well, you're looking at an evolutionary perspective. How come you only look at 20 years? It doesn't make sense, right? But research done on the transmission of information through digital media shows that it's more than enough. 20 years, you can really map factors that contribute to the flow of information across different channels. And we are also putting another constraint, which is the number of languages and we are looking at. So I already mentioned these 6 that we are working with. So hopefully this would be more manageable than the bigger picture. And we could build a methodology that it works with these constraints, and then if it's good enough, try to extend it to a bigger context. So the focus is on fan fiction, which can be defined as a community of readers and writers who reinterpret stories and further transmit modifications of them. So remember that the goal is to find innovations and new traits. This is very convenient because we have a very clear baseline. So we know what the original stories are, the canon, those published by or produced by certain publishing houses, authors, movie production teams. That's the baseline. And from that baseline, we can look at all variations that are introduced over time. Modifications that fan fiction authors decide are interesting for them, and they are transmitting over and over within this community of readers and writers. Okay, so this was the first rationale behind the choices made to select the corpus for this research. And let me tell you a little bit about how we are collecting the data and also modeling them so that we can do analysis on them. The main source is the biggest archive of fan fiction, which is the archive of our own, or AO3 for short. It's mainly an English platform, but it's so big that there is a lot of data also for many other languages. There are around 80 million stories at the cutoff point that we have for data collection, which is September 2022, and contains stories from more than 40,000 fandoms, so inspired by 40,000 different narrative universes. But in addition, we also have data collected from other platforms to balance a little bit the underrepresented languages on this platform. For instance, for Chinese, we have a Lofter. For Korean, we have a Post-type. So we try to build to balance a little bit. For Indonesian, we have a Wattpad. So because these are platforms that are more used in different cultural contexts. And from the stories that we have on this platform, we already have a lot of structured information in the form of metadata, right? So we have information about the relationship between characters. Is it a heterosexual? Is it a homosexual relationship? We have information about the characters involved, about the relationship between them. Are they involved in a romantic or erotic relationship, or more friend-like or family relationship? And we also have additional tags that are telling us what's in the story. So in this case, it's a romance where there is a love confession in the story, and there is some story elements that around the friendship development. So there is a little bit of the story traits that we want to analyze already. And these are data about the impact, number of comments, number of hits, so how many people have read the story, number of kudos, so how many people liked the story. There's already quite some information that we can use to try and look at story traits and how they change over time. To give you a little bit more of examples about the additional tag category, there is information about psychological traits of a character, narrative strategies used, the setting of a story, sometimes even the time frame. So there's quite a lot that we can use, but that's not enough. So what we are also doing is enriching this data, so processing the full text of the stories to extract linguistic, stylistic, thematic features of the stories that we can then use as story traits to analyze. And we do this through various NLP techniques. This is not an original idea. I mean, we learn from what the great work done by other people before us. There are already available data sets that do this kind of thing. They use these derived data or these extracted features. The biggest one is probably the Antitrust Research Center extracted features data set, where you have information at the page level about a lot of, so you have a bag of words representation of works, millions of works that are included in this collection. And you have other data sets that do something similar with them, different types of features that are extracted from text. We do something similar, and what we do is this process of knowledge extraction from fiction. And let me start explaining you a little bit about this with an example. So if you read this sentence in a story, a body was floating in the river, I guess most of the readers will somehow at least suspect that someone died in this story, right? And if you have a bit of context, more if you read the previous part of the story, or if you know, maybe you're reading a detective story or a thriller, so you're already expecting that someone is dying. So if you encounter this sentence, there's a high chance that this sentence is conveying you the message that there is a death event involved here. So someone died. But death is mentioned nowhere here. There is no killing, there is no one dying. It's just a very indirect way of saying that someone died. And this is fiction. We know it, right? It's not a direct way of communicating. It's most likely an indirect way of communicating. Also, what we can do is try and extract this information using existing linguistic tools for abstracting from the linguistic expression of the text, right? We could use tools like abstract meaning representation, which is a tool that had a theory first, and then a tool that has been developed to parse a sentence and have a structured representation of it. And this is the AMR representation of the sentence, where you would have a float event that takes two arguments. One is the subject of the argument, and one is the location of it. This is what is expressed in this sentence. But if you're analyzing a story, you're most likely interested in the fact that someone is dying here, rather than in the fact that there is a body floating in the river, right? So there is somehow a limitation in just focusing on the linguistic expression of the text. So this abstract meaning representation is not enough. So we need a further process of abstraction and interpretation that is involved in that humans are very good at doing, in moving from the body floating in the river and abstract this to the information someone died. So there is a death event in this story. So the task here would be to enrich this database of story traits that we can analyze. It would be, okay, given a passage from a story, can you give me information about a possible death event here? And if there is a death event, who's the victim? If there is a perpetrator, like this is a violent death, maybe who's the perpetrator? And is there any information about the way in which the character died? So these are three information that you can extract from here, right? Medusa killing hundreds of men by turning them into stone. But again, if you look at the excerpt, you will see that this is not expressed in a very direct way, right? Medusa giving a glance to people, and then you know that she took pleasure in turning men into stone, right? So there's seemingly disconnected sentences in the text, but as a human, it takes you 1 second to make the connection that someone died and how they died. Well, we now in 2024, we can luckily try new tools to try and extract this information, right? We don't necessarily need to focus on the processing of the linguistic expression only, but we can try and rely on LLMs to try and do this, right? So they supposedly have the ability to understand more the context and do some abstract reasoning or inference from the natural language. So to extract this information from all the stories they want to process, we need to automate this process, right? So we try to do it with LLMs. But the first thing is we wanted something to evaluate this. So we manually annotated a data set of 59 stories from the Greek, ancient Greek myth and lore tradition, fan fiction stories based on that. And what we found is that we did a pre-selection to target stories that are likely to include death events. So we found 234 death events with 63 different ways in which people are dying. And the authors can be very creative in the way they make their characters die. Like they can be slayed, stabbed, being eaten by a creature, being bitten by a snake, drowned, be torn to pieces by someone else. So you already see that there's something that is not likely to happen very often in real life, right? So leveraging tools that have been trained on data from social media or from news, it's very likely that these models wouldn't have seen this type of information because it's quite unique to fiction. Well, we tried anyway, right? We wanted to find a way of abstracting and extracting this information. So we set up a pipeline testing two models, Llama 3.1 and DeepSeek R1. 70 billion because we want to be able to do this locally. For copyright reasons, right? We can't send in copyright stories to an external server. And also because not everybody can afford to run a 600 billion parameters model locally or have it at a university. So 70 billion is somehow manageable at a research institute or university level. And again, an example is, okay, extract information about the victim, the perpetrator, and the mode of demise of a character. And so feed this text input to different models and extract that triplet of information. And this specific paragraph was not successful for neither Llama nor DeepSeek. They couldn't find this information. Maybe you see already what the problem is, right? Again, it's a very indirect way of conveying information. So there's a problem of co-reference, right? First of all, you have to understand that his own daughter refers to Iphigenia, right? And that to ensure good winds for the journey implies that this is a sacrifice. So the father who sacrifices the daughter for another purpose. So there is some inference, some context that you need to add to be able to extract this information. We also try to make that information more explicit by adding a summarization step. Right? Maybe by asking the model in the first place to summarize this fiction, making it more explicit, like you have in a summary very often, that you have in a more concise and explicit way a description of what's happening in the story. So we try to introduce this intermediate step and then ask for the extraction of the triplet. In this case, it didn't work very well. But let me show you the overall results on the analysis of the whole data set. And it's not good. So if you look at the F1 score, it's overall below 60%. So if not acceptable, if you are just a slightly above chance to extract this information automatically from the text, the stories you want to analyze. And maybe you can spot that the problem is in the recall, right? So the precision can get quite high, right? 87%, I can work with that. It's not bad. But recall is always quite low. So 43%, 33%. So the problem is maybe that when it's difficult, when it's a more indirect way, there's a more figurative language used, these models are still struggling in extract that type of information. And this is a big problem if you think about the bigger picture, right? Because if I want to understand what's specific about fiction and stories, that is important. Well, if the model is not good at finding information in maybe the parts of text that are specific to the language used in fiction, we are using a wrong method to try and answer a research question or to prepare the data in the first place. So what we did is, let's go back to humans. No LLMs. We are still experimenting with LLMs because there's a lot that they can help us with, but we are now working with the human annotation. So 7 languages, 14 annotators. We have 2 per language that are annotating characters in the stories, co-reference resolution of pronouns and other generic names used to refer to these characters, relationships between the characters that can be inferred from actions even, and emotions and mental states that these characters are perceiving or living. So we want to build ground truth that we can then leverage to fine-tune maybe transformer models that have a specific goal of classifying these story traits that we're interested in. And we have around 100,000 words per language that we are annotating. And hopefully this can lead us to better results than the ones I've shown you with LLMs. Okay, that was a little bit about how we are extracting the story traits from the stories to answer our research question. And well, the good news is that as soon as we get this information out of the stories, we are making it available for everybody to work with. So we're not just using for our own research questions. If you're interested in that, you can directly using it accessing our knowledge graph database. And we have a graphic interface also to make it easier a little bit to browse what's in there. It's incomplete, so there's not 8 million stories at the moment, just around 20,000, but we are little by little adding more of them. And now what we have is mostly information about literary quality. So information about syntactic complexity, lexical richness of these stories. But little by little, we'll be adding information about the characters and the events. So this is just a snapshot of what you can see in there. Like you can filter by language, you can filter by fandom, and these are different works with the title, word count, kudos, publication date, etc., plus all the linguistic measures and stylistic measures later on. What we have in the bigger database, which is not yet structured with all additional extracted information, is 8 million stories, mostly in English, you see, but well, for Korean, it's not bad anyway. Right? We can work with around 2,000 texts, plus the one that we are adding from post type and other sources. So yeah, there will be a lot of information, a lot of text that we can look at this transmission of traits across languages. But there is another issue, right? Once we extract all this information, how do we make it comparable across languages and cultures? So we need a data model that allows us to make sure that the traits that we know about Zeus are comparable with the traits that we extract from the character Jupiter, right? From the Harry Potter House of Gryffindor, Harry Potter House of Slytherin. How do we make this information comparable? Well, we needed to develop a data model for this. And more technically, what we did is develop a formal ontology to store, to organize this knowledge that we are extracting. So we reused the part of existing ontology for cultural heritage and bibliographic data, like SADOC CRM and LRMU. So we have information about the work, which has a specific linguistic expression or two different if there are translations of this, talking about a specific fandom with characters involved in this work that are taking part in different social relationships, have specific character features, and these characters are participating in events that take place in a setting within a specific narrative location. And we added also elements to focus more on the narrative roles and functions that these characters have. Who's the hero, who's the antagonist, for instance, or who's the victim, like who's the perpetrator, to add this information that can be extracted. All the kind of information that I mentioned before, the story traits, will be available, stored, and organized according to this data model, so that a query that you might have might be, well, give me all the works that have more than one language version, so that there are translations, and compare the character features that the same character has, right? You can extract the character features of the English version or the Korean version and see if the character features that the characters have are similar. And you can do the same thing about how is the character dying in different stories. So how is Harry Potter dying in several stories? If you extract events that are about death, you can compare different mode of demise of the character. Okay, so that was first part about the goals of the project, this part about the data collection and modeling. And now let me share with you some of the preliminary results of some analysis that we've done. It's not much, but it's something that can show you in which direction we are going. And I can start with an example of borrowing a concept from what is called the cultural evolution theory, which is the discipline looking specifically at how cultural traits are transmitted in different societies or groups. And what they call ratcheting is a specific type of innovation, which can be defined as the dependency of one new trait on an existing trait. So the cultural trait appearing at a time t+1 depends on innovation introduced at a previous time t. To make this very clear, the light bulb as an object, as a technology invented to bring us light, depends on the previous introduction of electricity as a technology, right? So there would be no way of inventing the light bulb if there is no electricity in the first place that we can use to provide the light using the light bulb. We can transfer the same things to stories and find if there are some new traits that depend on something existing previously, like the example of Harry Potter. So being in the house of Slytherin or in the house of Gryffindor depends on the existence of the Sorting Hat as an entity that picks the character and puts them into different houses. So what we did to analyze this is that we borrowed a method from ecology, looking at animals. Normally they do, right? So they go into a place in an island, let's say, and they look at how many animals they see of one species or a different species. And they have this model to determine the probability of finding a specific place where there is one species. So let's say that you go into the garden here, and how likely it is that you see a fox, given that you have seen a squirrel as well. And you maybe might think that what the relationship is because the fox are hunting squirrels, right? So it's something they survive on, so that might be the reason why you see them. But by applying this ecological method, you can also determine what dependencies there is. So this possible hunter-prey relationship can be suggested by a probabilistic model, just by looking at how often they occur in a sample of observations that you have. And what we did is that for a small sample, we tried to look at this and did some filtering of what makes sense to look at. And these are possible pairs that have this dependency of parent and child, right? Or hunter and prey, if you want. And I want to show you two examples that I highlighted here in orange. So when we have here in the column year of birth is the first appearance of the possible child tag, right? So this column. So the first time that emotional hurt appeared in this small sample of data is 2013. And the first time that psychological drama as a story trait appeared is 2011. And in the parent tag, the possible parent tag column, we have traits that exist before this year. So they are possibly in a dependency relationship, in a ratcheting relationship, right? So these tags could depend on the existence of this tag. It's very difficult to formulate the clear relationship between these two tags. But what is enough for the transmission pattern that we want to identify is, okay, let's see what's happening in time about the relationship between these two traits. And the thing to look at is how often do they co-occur, right? So in the first time the psychological drama appeared, 57% of the stories where psychological drama is appearing is together with romance, right? So 57% of the psychodrama stories are romance in the first year. And the same is for emotional heart and angst. So the first time that emotional heart, which is a trait that pertains to the events in the story, so it means that the characters are suffering somehow. So 54% of the time that we have an explicit mention of this story trait appears together with the trait angst, which is about an effect on readers. So angst is saying that the purpose of the author in writing this story is to make the reader somehow uncomfortable about what's happening, right? So the relationship here could be that a character, so an author is writing about a character suffering because they want to create a discomfort feeling in the reader. Well, let's have a look at what's happening over time. So in the first case, emotional heart, we see a continuous dependency or the continuous association between these two traits. So it's quite likely that this new innovation, so the appearance of the trait emotional heart, is because it's quite effective in achieving this effect on readers, making them uncomfortable about the story. Because we see that except for 1 year, the association is a constant between these two traits. So it might be that emotional heart is branching out of angst as a story trait. Something different is happening for a psychological drama and romance. So we see that in the first year, there is a very strong association between the two texts, but already starting in the year after, there's no significant association between these two texts. So possible interpretation of this is that maybe psychological drama originated as something specific to romance. So it's, again, branching out of romance as a specific subgenre, but then it took a different direction. So it's not staying anymore within as a subgenre of romance, but it's becoming something independent that can intersect other genres. And some more analysis is needed to understand what's the evolution of the psychological drama in this context. So this is an example of how story traits can evolve, and also looking at the possible relationships and dependencies between story traits. To show you another example is, well, let's look at the topics of the stories, right? So we did this not anymore at the document level, at the story level, but specifically at paragraphs. We want to find out where and when some specific topics are introduced in stories. And what we see here is for stories in English where Hermione Granger is the protagonist. We see that from very early on, stories about bonds, bonding, being soulmate, and maybe also having a tragic ending in these stories are quite popular from 2010 to 2022. But stories that talk about, or that are set in a train station, they talk about the journey and the Hogwarts experts as a train, are only becoming popular in a specific time range. So this is a way of looking for evidence of how some traits are introduced and are changed, because we might wonder what's happening here, right? Why at some point these stories become so popular? And of course, you could also normalize it looking at the growth of the platform where you find these stories. Like, is it just due to a spike in the number of people that are reading and posting on this platform, or is there more content-related motivation for this? A third example that I can give you is more closely looking at the relationship between story traits and the impact that they have on readers. And from all the stories that are already in the knowledge graph modeled according to the ontology, this is a graph showing you the relationship between word entropy, which is a measure of lexical unpredictability at the sentence level. And this could be a proxy of literary quality. So for some scholars, right? How unpredictable a story is a proxy of how good an author is at writing a story. And you see that the association here between word entropy and the kudos, so how many people liked that story, is somehow following a positive trend. So from this information, it's worth going on and investigate how is the relationship actually between the quality of the language used, or how specifically is it related to semantic information that can somehow have an impact on how well a story is received, or how much a story is liked by the readership. Okay, so these are were three examples that somehow try to show you what can be done by extracting information from stories and modeling them according to an ontology that allows you to compare stories across languages and different communities. But the main question we're asking here is also about evolution, right? How this is changing, where are we going? And I can show you now an hypothesis about what we could find at the end of the GOLEM project. Once we have all this information structured, and we can link information that is about the stories with information which is about the context where these stories are told. So about a specific culture or a specific language. And what we could find is that maybe we see that in the trait strong female lead for stories written in Korean became much more present after a certain time point, because we know that something happened in society at that specific time point. So like the Me Too movement in Korea. And the stories could be somehow responding to societal discourse about a specific topic. So this is a way of looking at evolution, and how the story traits can also depend on external factors, not only on intrinsic features of the stories. So this could be a relationship from society, from the cultural context to the stories. But we could also have maybe an inverse relations, which see that maybe, again, this is an hypothesis, we find that the combination of strong female lead and the trait queer, so stories about characters with the queer identities, it's appearing more often after this specific time point, maybe anticipating a change in society and in public discourse about a specific topic. So we can look in these transmission chains about what's happening within the stories. But of course, we always have to remember that we cannot just look at the data themselves. You always have to contextualize them and make sense of them within the cultural context and societal context your data are drawn from. Thank you very much. This was all from me, and I look forward to your question and discussing more about this. Also online, if you have questions.
It's just, this is a time filler, but what other experiments are you running with LLMs? Because as far as I understand, there are bigger models that seem to perform better than the ones that you have tried extracting the elements with. So what are your thoughts about using those large open models to do these extractions now that they're getting better and better by the month?
Yeah, so good question. Actually, the example that I showed you where the model was failing, I tried the same example with the 600 billion parameter models, and it works. So it's a term. So it's a problem of size, right? If you only have a smaller model of 70 billion parameters, might not be so good at extracting this type of information. But if you go for a larger one, it can do that. But so this is also intersecting a point that is very important for me. So I want the data and the methods of my research to be replicable by others, right? To be used by others. So if I only rely on technology that is available to who has the money, that doesn't work that well for me. Or if other people cannot replicate my results, it's not a good choice for me. And in this specific case, there is also a problem of copyright, as I mentioned. But I can't send text that it's in copyright on an external server, because it would be a breach of copyright. So it can work with out of copyright text potentially, but I still think that it's I believe that smaller, specific models tailored for tasks that we care about and curated would be a better future than just relying on generic large language model.
First of all, thank you for the great lecture. I was very, I enjoyed a lot. And I want to ask you about the bias So what kind of components in particular data do you and your team consider as bias? And I want to ask you one more question. Is there any way to say cultural bias as the uniqueness of work or author?
So by bias, you refer to the part I mentioned about the
before.
selection of the data, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I use the term bias in a very generic way, and to refer to possible factors that are affecting the phenomenon I'm interested in, but are just a noise or just an effect of what I don't want to look at, right? So in this case, if I have publishers that are selecting books, I'm not looking in general at the positive impact of books on people in general, but just on the positive impact of books on a specific category of readers, so professional readers that are working in the publishing house. So that would be a bias for me because it's hiding the phenomenon that I'm looking at. Yeah. And but yeah, more in general, I think the second part of your question is it's a very good one because there might be definitely specificities that are tied to specific authors or genres or reading communities or even platforms. Because from another study that I've been doing on book reviews, we know that if we select the book reviews from commercial platforms that are selling ebooks, rather than from platforms where you can just review the book for free without any commercial purpose attached to it, we see that there's different types of reviews published and different type of ratings given to books or shown to the people, right? So it might also be that there are a lot of different affordances and specificities related to platforms, data sources, genres, reading communities, and this might also change over time, right? Because a group of people interacting online in 2011 is very different from a group of people interacting online on the same platform 10 years later. So definitely, that's the complexity of social and cultural phenomena, right? We have to try and manage it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your talk. I've actually tried to think about your initial question about the power of narrative. There's a civilization without a will, but there's no civilization without a narrative and story. So given that, I think that the narrative and story has a really strong power in the civilization and also in constructing the kind of idea that we are kind of together, right? So, and the literature is one of the representation of the kind of a written word that kind of binds people together, that we are living in the same time and living together. So the question I'm asking you, this kind of thing, is that the reason is that so you're trying to analyze varieties of structure of the literature, and then I wonder if you have ever thought about conducting any research about the structure and the story of the literature and other social discourses. How are they really related together? Have you ever thought about that? Because for instance, you raised the question about the the Korean literature, the females being a leading a figure there, and the LGBTQ movement becoming a part of it in a Korean story. Then, like, does it mean something about the changing structure of the discourse about the female and LGBT in Korean society? Can we really talk about it? So it's kind of a how far to what extent can we push our digital humanities studies toward the study of the society? I think that's my question.
Yeah. Thank you. Very big question and very important one. I agree with you. Well, we are using computational methods and digital methods to analyze the cultural and social phenomena all the time, I think, right? And we have to keep that in mind. So I'm very wary of just having a data-driven research agenda, but I always try to connect it to more broadly what it means, what I'm doing for understanding humans and society and culture more in general. especially because there's so many factors that can influence how we interpret the results that we have. So yeah, the example that about different discourse happening in different places, not just in literature, it's very central to this, because I see literature as a system which is part of a broader system with other cultural systems within it. It could be, the publishing industry, the public media, private and public media outlets, or different types of social media where people are discussing different topics. And it's never something in isolation. I think we have to keep that in mind, right? Because authors get inspired or influenced by a lot of different factors or different conversations that they have in different places. So I'm always trying to keep in mind that the influences that we see might be coming from a different social phenomena, different context, and look at the two-way interactions between the different systems.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I'm curious about whether you observed any cultural or age-related patterns across different platforms, even on English-centered platforms like Wattpad and AO3, since their user bases and search systems are quite different and their user experience is different. So do you think this features shape the kinds of fan fiction they get written or gain visibility?
Yeah, great question, which connects to the previous one, right? So it's again about the demographics, in this case, of the readers we are looking at and the authors we are looking at. And this is also tied to my framing of this whole research project as trying to reduce the complexity of what we are looking at. And yeah, what we have to keep in mind is that the demographics of these authors and readers is skewed towards certain age ranges, right? And so overall, we might find something about the transmission patterns of story traits, but it might be that it's very specific to the platforms we looked at or to the age range of the people that we looked at interacting around these stories. Absolutely, this is something that plays a role. We haven't tackled that issue yet, because one of the main goals of this project is, first of all, to try and find a method of looking at these patterns and analyze them. And then once we are satisfied with a method and say, okay, it's good enough to look at these patterns, like this is a knowledge extraction pipeline that we created, and then storing these information according to a model, we say, wow, we have this model, it works well enough. Maybe then now we can apply it to other publishing systems or literary systems that are not related to fan fiction, not related only to young authors and writers, right, and readers, but more broadly to other existing data sets that can be enriched in the same way. So that way, there will be then a comparative effort to be done by extending this model to other data sets and other systems.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. It's really thought-provoking and intriguing. I believe one of the contributions you are making is to, in terms of literary evolution, you structure how we can trace the traits of characters and the traits of narrative dynamics. They are linked together to make a literary evolution. So, and then that system is so working, not just like author's intention, but also with fans' intention to write. So, as for that matter, I have a question about, your hypothesis that, there is original story, one original version of a starting point, and then you are saying that fanfics adding some variants of to B, C, D, put together to equal. So in that case, I mean, what if certain body, certain character types, or certain settings, or whatever, are losing in that very variation? Do your instructors capturing that as well? That's one question. And the second one is, I mean, you showed us a big map of linking, like the traits of characters and the traits of the narrative.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Yeah, the first one, I would love to find story traits that are dying and disappearing, right? Because then I could try to find the answer for the reason why they are disappearing. So in the beginning, I formulated the specific question we're trying to answer as what story traits spread, become successful, and disappear, right? So the disappearance is also very, very interesting, right? Because why at some point we decide not to, well, it's just very vague statement, why nowadays we don't have any more very long descriptive parts in novels like we used to have in the 18th or 19th century. Think about Tolstoy if you want, like very long descriptive parts in novels. Why that trait disappeared from contemporary storytelling novels? So that would be, then once you find these cases, it would be interesting to look at the possible explanations of why certain traits are disappearing. So definitely we want to look into it. This was just a small example of looking at innovation, so new traits appearing. But it would be interesting to also look in the other direction and things that get lost. And coming to this model, it took us 2 years to build this. It's not easy because there's a lot of theoretical work that goes into this to understand how you can turn existing literary theories and ontological theories, reception theories, fan studies theories into a model that can work. And especially the goal for this was to design a data model that would be applicable as broadly as possible. So not only work for written text, but if you notice, we're talking about, well, learning also from existing best practices. We're talking about work and expression that are concepts that can be applied to films, right? To live performances even, right? There's no specific terms that relates to written text because we want this to include and model different type of media, different type of formats. And it's documented in the GitHub repository of the GOLEM project. So if you go there, you will see how the overall ontology is created and what each module is doing, like the character module, the event module, the narrative dynamics module. It's explained a little bit more. And we made 3 submissions, 3 articles that are coming out very soon about this, explaining the character part, the grounding in the existing work about formal ontologies development and semantic web technologies. And then also 1 article presenting the overall ontology. So that will be out very soon where you can read all the details. But the general idea in developing this model is that we didn't want to be normative in how we are organizing the information about the characters or other story traits. So there is no specific theory that informed this model, but we try to look at different theories. And that's why, for instance, we have the concept that I didn't put it here, but we have a narrative event as a concept, but then we have a narrative unit and a narrative sequence as another separate concept, as a separate class. And by using narrative unit and narrative sequence, we can use them to model different things of the narrative. Think about two classic concepts of fabula and sujet, like story and discourse. So the chronological order of the event or the presentation order in the narrative, right? By modeling the events as narrative units that can be sequenced in two different ways, in a chronological order or in a work presentation order, let's say, you could have the same units that are modeled according to two different sequences. So we can accommodate these two different things. And if you want, you can also do something different. You could have narrative units that correspond to Vladimir Prop elements, right? Vladimir Prop functions, right? And you can have a sequence of functions modeled according to prop theory. So hopefully, this model is a theory agnostic that so can be applied to and used in combination with different literary theories. And this is what is informed all the modules that we have here.
All right, yeah, thank you very much for stimulating talk. I am curious of whether there are attempts to simulate cultural transmission or innovation within a large language model. Say, I can imagine training a large language model with the data from a specific culture or language and see how the writing style of the LLM changes with additional data from a different culture fed into the model. So do you think it will imitate the changes in the real world in the fiction writing field?
Yeah, brilliant question. I had the same idea. We haven't done it yet. If you want, we can do it together. But so the question is, do I think that like a specifically trained model would simulate transmission patterns that can be observed in reality, so with humans and specific societies we're looking at? I mean, that's the starting assumption, right? I think at least yes, to some extent, because you can have control on the training data of the model you're using, right? And you can have a specific model trained on romance and one trained on science fiction and see what's going on if suddenly the science fiction readers start to read the romance and write stories about romance, right? What kind of stories do they write about? But yeah, there are different experiments that could be done. Yeah, and I like very much the idea of simulating, possible transmission patterns.
Right. Yeah, I think it can be a very interesting study, as we can assume that the real world is a large language model, learning from the literatures coming out. So
there's one big problem here though, is the pre-training data of the model, right? So this is something I didn't talk about, but it's something that happened in that event extraction experiment that we did. So our domain is a Greek mythology fanfiction, right? So these characters are very well known. So they're coming from very established cultural traditions. And well, at least Wikipedia is in the pre-training data of all large language models, right? And there are Wikipedia entries about Greek mythology. So what happened in one case, or in several cases, is that we got information about who's dying and how they are dying, especially. So the mode of demise of the character, with kind of information that was not present at all in the story. It was hallucinated, but actually it was not hallucinated. It was just an information leakage from the pre-training data. Because we looked into the thinking output of DeepSeek R1, right? Because it's showing you the reasoning steps. And the reasoning step there was because, I don't remember which character, very often in the tradition dies in this way, I'm giving you as an output what the tradition is saying. And you see that this is very problematic, right? Because if you want to detect innovation about similar entities, if you're relying on the status quo or the established tradition, you are losing that innovation because it's overwritten by what is existing before. So it would be great to do this kind of simulation with different language models, but probably what you have to do is pre-train from scratch small models on this. Yeah. There are a couple of studies that, I mean, no one for sure that try to look at this for language acquisition in children, right? So they use the word embeddings, so even a previous way of representing semantic information. And they trained embeddings on corpora of increasing lexical complexity and also in terms of amount of books, right? Because the hypothesis is that when you are 6 years old, you have only read a certain amount of books. When you're 8 years old, you have read more books and even more complex books, right? So they try to simulate this process of language acquisition and also story literacy acquisition. And if I remember correctly, they found a correlation, a positive correlation between the embedding representation of the text and the human response of readers.
Do we have any questions on Zoom? I'm giving you the last chance. If not, let's give our speaker a big applause and we'll end the conversation here for today. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I really like them.
I know.